Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. There's still a few people logging on, so we're going to just take a couple minutes before we get started. Hello, my name is Brian DiPaolo, and I'm the Director of Strategic Services at Accudata Systems. I will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our third bi-monthly PCI Qualified Security Assessor Open Forum. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few action items. First, because this is an open forum, feel free to ask questions through the chat window in your browser. We did receive some questions during the registration period, so we'll answer those first, and then we'll move on to your questions afterwards. If you were unable to get your question answered today, we will respond to you personally over the next 72 hours. So if you have any questions, please submit them. After the webinar today, each attendee will receive a post-event email that will include a full recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides and some other resources to help you with PCI compliance. So today, you're joined by two extremely knowledgeable experts who have been working with PCI 3.2 since it was announced. First, I'd like to introduce Risk and Compliance Consultant John Fisher. John has been in the IT field for more than 20 years and is a certified PCI QSA. John routinely performs PCI ROC assessments for Level 1 merchants and service providers, and also has a very strong background in application security. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Senior Technology Manager Josh Berry. Josh has been a QSA since 2010 and holds a CISSP and an Offensive Security Certified Professional certification. Josh has extensive experience with penetration testing, vulnerability management, as well as PCI ROCs for Level 1 merchants and service providers. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. We appreciate you joining us, and I'm going to jump into the first question. So I'm going to direct this first question to Josh. Does PCI 3.2 require Suite 2B compliant cryptography?
The short answer to that question is no. PCI DSS refers to the use of strong cryptography for sending, receiving, storing cardholder data or other sensitive information like credentials. They have a glossary on the Security Standard Council's website that defines strong cryptography and notes AES 128-bit plus encryption, triple DS with triple link keys, and a couple other algorithms, and then refers to the NIST publications on cryptography, key strengths, and guidance. For algorithms that aren't listed in that glossary explicitly, NIST would be the appropriate standard. The Suite B is a set of NSA promoted algorithms, some of which are actually noted as strong cryptography, but it isn't the right source to use for PCI DSS.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Josh gave a very thorough answer there.
All right, well, let's move on to the next question. So John, I'm going to ask this one to you. Does the completion of the SAQ or the self-assessment questionnaire for a level 4 merchant require assistance or attestation from a QSA?
Okay, good question, and good afternoon, everybody. The answer there is possibly yes, but usually no. Unless your bank has notified you or you've experienced a breach in your environment, you do not have to have a QSA to attest for your SAC. Some organizations do like to bring in a QSA just to provide maybe their customers, higher quality assurance that their controls are in place, or they just want to make sure that they're doing things right. And of course, we're here to help in that situation. But generally speaking, a level 4 merchant does not require assistance of a QSA. Josh, anything?
No, I think that pretty well covers it.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add is really if Accudata looks at the engagements that we work with our clients around, a very large percentage, I'd say probably somewhere around half of our PCI related engagements are with merchants that don't require a report on compliance. We typically, it's very rare they ask for a attestation as part of that. Occasionally they do, but rarely. But we do see a lot of engagement with those merchants just to help them through the process. But in terms of attestation, that is typically reserved for those clients that only require a report on compliance. So that would be, level 1 merchants, sometimes level 2, depending on their card brand requirements, and then service providers. So with that, I will move on to the next question. And I'll go back to Josh. So this is a fairly open-ended question, but you can go ahead and get us started on this. Is what are the new changes in PCI 3.2?
So one of the changes that finally goes into effect is the SSL TLS remediation guidance, where you have to upgrade to TLS 1.1 or later for protecting administrator access to in-scope system components, as well as transmission of cardholder data over the internet. The other controls include the requirement to document your cryptographic architecture. This one's specific to service providers. So documenting how and what is used to encrypt cardholder data. Another key requirement that's going into place is, as part of your change control process, ensuring that all significant changes in the environment, that PCI has been applied to all significant changes. That one is 646. Another one that applies to both merchants and service providers is the requirement for multi-factor authentication to access any systems within the cardholder data environment. And then the remainder are generally geared towards service providers. So 10.8 is a requirement to have controls in place to detect failures of other controls. So if logging stops working in your firewall or antivirus stops working for some reason, that you have something in place that alerts you to that fact. Service providers are also in 11.341 required to conduct more frequent penetration tests. So after any significant change, but also perform segmentation testing, I believe every 6 months. 12.4.1 is another requirement that is new and includes bringing executives into the PCI DSS process and sign off on executive responsibility. And then the last one, 12.11, is a quarterly process to review all the various operational tasks and validate that the daily log reviews and those kinds of things, those recurring type processes are actually happening. A lot of these, if you notice, are kind of geared towards helping to ensure that compliance becomes a security program rather than a try and check all the boxes off at the end of the year. John, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the summary of the changes. The only thing I would throw in there is, you know, of all the things that Josh just listed there, probably the most difficult one to manage is going to be the multi-factor authentication for access to the CDE. And it's something you want to make sure you get a head start on. And of course, Accudata can help you out with that if you guys need some assistance.
John, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on why would you need more time around that control?
Well, because it could be difficult to implement. So currently, you know, they have not required multi-factor authentication. So typical authentication mechanisms that were, you know, probably been in place for many years were just fine so long as they were encrypted. But nowadays, you're going to have to implement a second factor, such as a token or possibly a certificate, something like that, in order to gain access to the cardholder data environment, even if it's from the, you know, any untrusted network, but even if the network is part of your, you know, corporate internal landscape. If it's considered an untrusted network or outside of the CDE, I believe it requires a multi-factor authentication to access the CDE now. So that certainly adds some integration time, selecting a solution, and, you know, it can be tricky. It's not going to be the easiest thing on that list to get done.
Thanks, John, for the clarification. Yeah, we definitely see that across our customers, and that, again, the requirement up until now has been remote access only, so meaning, you know, coming in from outside the network. But in most environments, segmentation is used to where the corporate network and various other parts of the network are, as John said, untrusted or segmented off from the cardholder data environment. So because of that, those environments now also have to provide that multi-factor authentication. So with that, let's move on to the next question. So John, I'll go back to you. Do I need to update my current ROC with Do I need to update my current ROC with 3.2 standards if I was validated before January 31st, 2018?
Okay, well that's a great question. The answer is, again, yes and no, and I hate to give that answer, but I guess QSAs love that answer. But the idea is before your next validation occurs, you need to make sure those controls are in place so you don't run into any roadblocks getting your PCI assessment done. However, there's no requirement that if you have a valid ROC or SAC right now, that let's say it was done in the last, 11 months or something, there's no requirement by the PCI Security Council that you go back and update that documentation just because we are about to pass January 31st. So just make sure those controls are in place before your next assessment so that things will go smoothly. You got anything else, Josh?
No, I think that covers it. The key is that you're responsible for implementing them, but you're not going to have to update a previous ROC.
All right, thanks guys for the clarification. So those are all the questions that were submitted prior to or as part of the registration process, and we've had several other questions come in. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to those now. I guess Josh, I'll go back to you. This is kind of almost a follow-on to what was just discussed, but I'll go ahead and ask it. What should I do if I know I won't be compliant before February 2018?
Well, the first thing that you need to do is engage a QSA if you haven't already done so. Compliance with PCI DSS is pretty complex, and I recommend working with the QSA because they're going to have a knowledge and understanding to help you kind of wade through it. The next thing that I would recommend, if your company is new to PCI DSS and your acquiring bank is requiring an attestation to an SAQ or ROC for the first time, then you're likely going to need to work with them on an extension. And that's another reason you need a QSA, because they can help perform a gap assessment against controls that are not in place and develop realistic timeframes for achieving compliance and getting a completed, validated SAQ and ROC. If you have gone through the attested SAQ and ROC process, then you will need to, again, work with the QSA to develop a realistic time frame and work with the acquiring bank on setting expectations for compliance. But and then the other option is, in working with the QSA, is to develop compensating controls in lieu of some of the new requirements. We always like to steer customers away from compensating controls where we can, just because they often are complex and in many cases end up being more difficult and expensive in the end to manage than the original control. But sometimes you really can't get around it, and you have to implement something that compensates. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to just expand a little bit on one point that you made. Oftentimes, for newer companies or just companies that have not done a PCI assessment before or been through one, we do a lot of gap assessments where we come in and we sit down with the business owners, the process owners, and control owners, and kind of go through exactly what controls are likely in place right now and what's not, and we draft a report that basically shows them where their most significant gaps and their higher risk gaps are in compliance, and help them sketch out a roadmap to get compliant. Now, another point that Josh made there was about asking the bank for an extension, which is something that we do, we assist with a lot. In fact, we will provide letters of engagement where it's required to show your bank that you have engaged a QSA. And oftentimes those banks are going to ask for what's called a prioritized approach, which is a standard document that was developed by the PCI Council that allows us to go through a subset of the 400 plus controls and not only indicate whether they are in place or not in place, but if they're not in place, what a projected time frame would be for getting them in place. And some companies tend to underestimate, so to speak, the projected time frame for getting them implemented. And a QSA guidance there can actually help you significantly in establishing realistic time frames. And it's usually better, it is better to give a realistic estimate of when you're going to become compliant, because asking for an extension more than once does not usually wind up with a second one being granted. Not saying it won't, but it's less likely to get granted the second time around.
Thanks, John. That was great insight. Actually, I'm going to come back to you with the next question. So we talked about, Josh went through the list of different PCI controls, but I guess what would you say is the theme across 3.2 based on the evolution of the standard and the changes they made? What is the theme you see across those?
Okay, that's a really good question too. I would say the evolution of PCI in general has centered around the breach activity that's occurred out there, the things that have cost the card brands and the merchant banks money. They've identified the common things that happen, and those have led to the development of the standard. And so as, you know, attacks they're ongoing every day, let's face it. We all know that. But they're evolving in their complexity and, quite frankly, in some of the tricks they play to get into your systems and steal your cardholder data and personally identifiable information and other things that can really be very expensive, not only to your business reputation, but to your bottom line. And so as these things have been learned, because after every breach, there's a forensics investigation that goes on to discover how it happened, and then those things directly lead to the evolution of the standard. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess what I'd also throw in there is I know there is a lot of there's a lot more focus on maintaining PCI. So we've been doing this for a long time, and I know in the beginning we saw a lot of customers treat this like a final exam at the end of the year. And the reality is there's many controls now, and even more with 3.2 that are now required to prove that you're maintaining those controls throughout the year to ensure you're mitigating that risk. One other thing I might also mention is 3.2. A lot of these future dated controls that go into effect in February, the majority of them are pointed towards service providers. But just to highlight for the merchants on the phone, each of you who uses a service provider, you are ultimately accountable. So the idea is that you must use a PCI compliant service provider. So you want to make sure your service providers are addressing these controls that are now new as part of PCI 3.2. So with that, I'll jump to. It looks like we have a few more questions that came in. So I'm going to go through those before we wrap up. Josh, I'll come back to you. Specific to the changes in 3.2, one of the things that also occurred was a change to the self-assessments and how how iframe and redirects are interpreted. Can you provide some clarity on that? Because I know that's something that's often overlooked.
Yeah, sure. So what changed is some of the applicable requirements previously in some of the earlier versions of the SAQs for the iframe redirect, SAQA. It was primarily limited to a handful of physical security controls, mostly if you had paper media that contained cardholder data, and then policies and procedures around another handful of applicable controls, and that was it. Recent updates to that particular SAQ also now include in the requirement 2 section on changing or disabling vendor defaults, and then adding in a few of the account and password controls within requirement 8. Those controls would be specific to the web server or servers that perform, or the load balancer, whatever device performs the redirect or hosts the iframe. So it'd be limited to those systems, but it's definitely something to watch out for if that's the type of environment that you have configured for e-commerce.
Thanks, Josh. And just to clarify, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to see if John had anything to add to that.
Yeah, no, not at all. That's spot on.
Yeah, and I was just going to clarify, just in terms of just not knowing the audience that we have in terms of everyone's role, but just to again clarify in terms of the typical use case for iframe and the redirect is again in that e-commerce environment where you would have rather than have your own web server host some sort of e-commerce transaction, you would then basically redirect that to a service provider of some sort, and so it still flows through, or it's still the initial connection is coming through your web server, so there is certain controls that are applicable, which is really what Josh was reviewing. Looks like we've got one last question that came in, and we'll go through that and then we'll wrap up. So I'm going to point this one back to John. So the question is, the PCI Council provided additional guidance around scope in the past year. Can you clarify what are the major changes that were included?
Okay, great question. Basically, it was really the first time in the history of the PCI Council that they actually published a information supplement regarding how to define scope. That's always been, for us as QSAs, and probably for yourselves if you're self-assessing, been one of the most difficult things to kind of wrap your mind around or define, and it typically, it is difficult for organizations. Of course, the organizations want the smallest amount of scope possible, because that's the less systems that are involved, the lower the cost and complexity of getting compliant. The paper that came out, which if this is okay, Brian, will we be able to send them a link to this after the webinar?
Absolutely. That's all published on the PCI Council's website, so we can definitely send that.
Okay, fantastic. Basically, they mentioned things like the use of PCI-listed P2PE, which stands for point-to-point encryption solutions. They don't specifically get into individual or specific examples of those, but there is a place on the council where there's validated solutions out there. A point-to-point encryption solution, just very briefly, is going to be a solution where, for example, if you go to a convenience store or many stores these days and they have a separate terminal where you swipe or insert your card, those terminals have hardware encryption modules in them, and the other end of that being either your bank or perhaps an encryption or decryption environment hosted by the service provider that's installed that third-party terminal, or will be the only two places that can unscramble. So in other words, when they load the encryption keys in the hardware device, those are usually done by some sort of CPA firm, and then the only other entity on earth that knows the keys in order to unencrypt the data is the bank or the decryption environment that is validated as such. So they offer some guidance on that, and by the way, that is just from my personal opinion, the quickest way to PCI compliance if, in fact, you have a brick and mortar type operation. And so, generally speaking, there's a lot of guidance in there about segmentation, how to minimize the size of your cardholder data environment, or CDE. There's guidance in there about selecting your service providers and other third parties, and then some additional guidance on whose responsibility is to confirm the scope. So it's a good read. It's not a tremendously long read, but it will help you. There's some diagrams in there as well. Josh, you got anything else you want to add on that?
No, I think that's a pretty good high-level overview.
All right. Well, I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank everyone for your time, and as a reminder, check our post-event email for additional resources, or feel free to contact us with additional questions, and we'll certainly get back to you. But with that, we appreciate you joining, and have a great day.